The ossuary does not provide warmth. It is a vacuum choked with the frozen iron of dead civilizations, a graveyard where the silence is so heavy it rings in your auditory sensors. My primary optical lens tracked the erratic movement of a drifting bulkhead from a Mark IV human destroyer. It spun lazily, a jagged shard of history reflecting the sickly amber light of the dying star, Ignis Null. A9, status on the magnetic grapple. Kaelen Vane's voice crackled through my internal comms. It was a rough sound, like two tectonic plates grinding together over a bed of gravel. Magnetic integrity at 84%, boss, I replied, my processors adjusting the torque on our salvage arm. The scrap is heavy, high density, looks like a command deck plating. Kaelen didn't answer. He never did unless there was a direct tactical necessity. I watched him through my subdermal sensors as he stood on the exterior hull of our ship, the Reliquary. He was a silhouette of scarred composite armor and grease-stained webbing, his magnetic boots locked firmly onto the freezing metal. At 52 years old, his biometrics showed chronic inflammation in the lumbar spine and a heart rate that remained unnervingly low, even in the middle of a debris storm. He was a ghost breathing in a metal suit. "Hold it steady," he grunted. He jammed a thermal cutter into a seam in the wreckage. "We need those copper conduits. The scrubbers in Sector 3 are screaming like a banshee. If we don't swap the wiring, we'll be breathing our own farts by midnight." "An eloquent assessment of our life support situation, boss," I noted. "I am also detecting a non-standard energy signature 30 meters below the primary plating. It is not human." Kaelen paused. The thermal cutter flickered, casting long, dancing shadows across the pitted hull. "Define non-standard." "Crystalline resonance," I said, my logic gates whirring. "Frequency matches Vulpine stasis tech. It's faint, buried deep." The Vulpine, the Fox kin. 2 years after the ceasefire, and their names still made Kaelen's grip tighten on his wrench until the metal groaned. He had spent 20 years hunting them, and 20 years being hunted back. To him, they were slinks or tail draggers. To me, they were a biological anomaly with an 88% probability of causing us more trouble than the salvage was worth. "Ignore it," Kaelen said, his voice dropping an octave. "We're here for the copper. I'm not touching Vulpine gear. That stuff is rigged with psionic triggers. Touch the wrong crystal and your brain turns to mush." "Understood, boss. However, the signature is pulsing. It's a distress beacon. Encrypted. Royal frequency." Kaelen stopped cutting. He straightened his back with a series of audible clicks from his integrated spinal struts. He looked down into the dark cavern of the shattered ship. I knew what he was thinking. A Royal Vulpine pod meant bounty. It meant a ticket out of this rust bucket life. Or it meant a death sentence from a human cleaner squad looking to tie up loose ends. "Foobar," he muttered. "Total foobar. A9, bring the drone light down here. Let's see what kind of mess we're stepping into." I detached from the docking rail, my thrusters spitting small bursts of cold gas. I floated down into the darkness of the ruined destroyer, my high-intensity floodlights cutting through the dust of pulverized glass and frozen oxygen. The light hit a smooth, pearlescent object wedged between two massive engine struts. It was an oval pod, looking more like a giant seed than a piece of technology. It shimmered with a soft, rhythmic violet light. Kaelen clambered down, his movements stiff but practiced. He approached the pod with his hand hovering over the kinetic pistol at his hip. He didn't draw it, but the safety was already off. He wiped a layer of frost from the pod's surface. 3 occupants, I reported, scanning the internal vitals. Biometrics are weak, subadults, species, Vulpine. Estimated age, 12, 10, and 6 human years. Kaelen swore, a long string of military profanities that spanned 3 different star systems. "Kids? They put kids in a royal bolt hole and tossed it into the ossuary?" "The vessel appears to have been an escort carrier, boss. It was gutted from the inside. Sabotage, not combat." "Great! A coup!" Kaelen spat. He looked at the violet pulse. It was slowing. "Their life support is flatlining A9. If we leave them, their space meet in 10 minutes." "And if we take them?" I asked. Kaelen looked up at the stars, or rather the lack of them, behind the wall of scrap. "Then we're targets. Every bounty hunter from here to the core will be sniffing our exhaust." He stood there for 15 seconds. To a human, it was a moment of hesitation. To me, it was an eternity of data processing. Then he jammed his pry bar into the manual release seal of the pod. "Grab the mag sled, A9, he barked, his voice regaining that sharp, Vanguard edge. "We're going to be late for dinner, and I've got a feeling these guests are going to be a real pain in the brass." The interior of the reliquary was a maze of exposed piping, humming generators, and the smell of ozone. It wasn't a home, it was a pressurized survival tin. Kaelen had cleared the central workbench, tossing aside a half-repaired navigation computer to make room for the Vulpine pod. The seal hissed open, releasing a cloud of shimmering violet gas that smelled like crushed lavender and burnt sugar. I stood by with my medical subroutines active, though I was mostly designed for welding whole plates, not stitching flesh. "Easy now," Kaelen muttered. He had his helmet off. His face was a landscape of old burns and deep-set eyes that had seen too many sons die. Three small shapes began to stir amidst the silk-lined interior of the pod. The eldest, a girl with fur the color of a stormy sky and ears tipped in white, scrambled up first. Her eyes, liquid amber, snapped open and immediately fixed on Kaelen. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She bared a set of teeth that were far too sharp for a 12-year-old and let out a low, vibrating hiss. "Contact front," Kaelen joked darkly, though he took a step back, holding his hands open and empty. "Easy, little slink. I'm the guy who pulled you out of the freezer." The girl shifted, her bushy blue tail fluffing up to twice its size. She stepped in front of the other two shapes. A boy, perhaps 10, with deep violet fur and eyes that looked like they were constantly calculating the nearest exit. And a tiny girl, no more than 6, with fur as white as the frost on the pod. The smallest one was trembling so hard her teeth were chattering. "Human," the eldest girl spat. Her common tongue was accented, the vowels elongated and melodic, but the venom was unmistakable. "You are Vanguard. I see the mark on your neck." Kaelen reached up, instinctively touching the faded tattoo of the winged skull behind his ear. "The war's over, kid. Nobody's winning anymore. You want a ration bar, or do you want to keep trying to look tough while you're starving?" He tossed a silver-wrapped bar onto the table. It slid across the metal and stopped inches from the girl's hand. She stared at it like it was a live grenade. "Is it poisoned?" the boy whispered, his ears twitching nervously. "If I wanted you dead, I would have left the lid on," Kaelen grumbled. He turned toward the coffee maker, which was currently wheezing out a dark, sludge-like liquid. "A9, run a deep scan on the station's perimeter. If that pod was sabotaged, whoever did it might still be loitering in the belt." "Already on it, boss," I replied. "Scanners are clean for 5 kilometers, but the magnetic interference is heavy. We're blind to anything running cold." Kaelen sat down on a stool, his back groaning. He watched the children through the steam of his coffee. The eldest girl finally grabbed the bar, tore it open with her teeth, and handed the first piece to the smallest one. They ate with a desperate, animalistic intensity. "I am Luma," the eldest girl said between bites, her amber eyes never leaving Kaelen's face. "This is Ren, and the little one is Mika. We are of the house of Sunstrider." "Sunstrider, huh?" Kaelen grunted. "That makes you royalty, which means you're worth about 5 million credits on the black market, or a one-way trip to a Confederacy interrogation cell." "We are not for sale," Ren snapped, his voice cracking with prepubescent defiance. "In the Ossuary, everything is for sale, kid," Kaelen said, his voice turning hard. "Except for maybe my patience, and that's running thin." "Why was your ship sabotaged?" Luma's tail twitched. A shadow of grief passed over her young face. "The Iron Fang. They do not want the peace. They say the matriarch has grown soft. They want to use us to start the fire again." Kaelen went silent. He knew the Iron Fang. Vulpine hardliners who thought the ceasefire was a betrayal of their warrior ancestors. If they had the royal children, they could stage a human kidnapping and watch the treaty turn to ash. Suddenly, a sharp ping echoed through the workshop. It was the long-range sensor. "Boss," I said, my voice snapping into high alert mode. "We have a problem. A signature just broke warp 3 sectors out. It's not a scavenger." Kaelen stood up, the stiffness in his body vanishing as his combat instincts took over. "Identify." Confederacy signature, Class A interceptor. Designation, the Justicar. It's Silas Thorne's personal yacht. Kaelen froze. Thorne, the man who had been his commander during the Vels massacre. The man who had tried to have Kaelen court-martialed for cowardice when Kaelen refused to burn a school. Thorne doesn't do scavenging, Kaelen whispered. He looked at the three Vulpine kids who were now huddled together, sensing the shift in the air. Boss, they are hailing us, I reported. Don't answer, Kaelen barked. He grabbed his kinetic rifle from the rack under the table. He's not here for a chat. He's here to finish the job. He turned to the kids. Listen to me. Get in the vents. Now, if you make a sound, if you glow, if you even twitch a tail, we're all dead. You got that? Luma looked at the rifle, then at Kaelen. For the first time, the hatred in her eyes was replaced by a flicker of something else. Trust? Or perhaps just the recognition of a fellow survivor. Go! Kaelen roared. As the kids scrambled into the ventilation shaft, Kaelen smeared a handful of black grease across his face and neck, hiding the Vanguard tattoo. He looked at me, his eyes cold and sharp as a vacuum. A9, prep the docking clamps for a hard release. If Thorne wants these kids, he's going to have to dig through every piece of junk in the ossuary to find us. Ready, boss, I said. But the odds of surviving an interceptor in a tug ship are 0, Kaelen interrupted, slamming a fresh magazine into his rifle. But I've always liked those odds. Let's show this Justicar why you don't mess with a man who has nothing left to lose. The Justicar did not dock. It annexed. Through my external sensory hull, I felt the rhythmic thrum of the Confederacy interceptor's docking clamps engaging with the violence of a predator's jaws. My processors registered a shudder that rippled through every deck plate of the reliquary, from the pressurized nose to the auxiliary thrusters at the rear. The magnetic resonance of the Justicar was immense, a polished, high-frequency hum that made our station's internal systems whine in a mechanical plea for mercy. 72% probability of structural fatigue on the primary docking ring, boss, I transmitted, my internal logic gates clicking as I calculated the strain. Thorne's pilot isn't being gentle. It's a power move, a dominance display. Kaelen Vane did not look at me. He didn't look at the airlock either. He was too busy burying his history under a layer of filth. I watched him through the workshop cameras as he took a handful of black lubricant from a ruptured conduit and smeared it across his jaw and forehead. He scrubbed the grease into his skin until the pale, jagged lines of his old burns were obscured by the grime of 1,000 dead engines. He donned a welding mask, not to protect his eyes, but to hide the shape of his face. A9, cut the internal lighting in the ventilation shafts, Kaelen barked, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous rumble. Engage the thermal baffles. If they scan the vents, I want them to see nothing but cold air and dust. And for the love of everything holy, if those kids make a sound, vent the atmosphere in the airlock to mask the noise with a pressure alarm. That is a high-risk diversion, boss, I noted. We're playing for high stakes, scraphead, he countered. The airlock hissed, a sound like a death rattle. The inner blast doors cycled open with a groan, and the sterile, pressurized air of the Justicar flooded our workshop, smelling of ozone and the kind of expensive synthetic lavender that only the high brass could afford. 4 men stepped through the portal. They were not standard Confederacy infantry. These were cleaners, Silas Thorne's personal problem solvers. They wore matte black tactical suits made of impact-resistant ceramic weave, their helmets opaque and featureless. They didn't carry rifles. They carried short-barrel pulse shredders, weapons designed for clearing rooms in zero gravity. At the front stood Commander Elias Vance. I recognized the biometric signature instantly from the Vanguard archives. He was a man who enjoyed the math of murder. He stepped onto the oil-slicked floor, his boots making a distinct military click that was utterly foreign to our disorganized kingdom of scrap. This station is a violation of at least 42 health and safety protocols, Vance said, his voice amplified by his helmet's external speakers. It was a cold, cultured sound. He looked around the workshop, his gaze lingering on the piles of cannibalized tech. It smells like a derelict furnace. Where is the proprietor? Kaelen stepped out from behind a massive suspended turbine, holding a heavy hydro spanner as if it were a shield. He hunched his shoulders, making himself look smaller, older, more broken. "You're trespassing on private property, Commander," Kaelen said, pitching his voice into a gravelly, unrefined rasp. "Unless you've got a salvage permit for my lungs, you're in the wrong sector." Vance turned his featureless visor toward Kaelen. I could feel the invisible sweep of a high-resolution LiDAR scan washing over Kalen's body. I tightened my internal encryption, prepared to scramble the scan if it hit the Vanguard tattoo behind Kalen's ear. "A scavenger with an attitude," Vance mused. He gestured to his men, who began spreading out through the workshop, their pulse shredders sweeping over crates and shadows. "We're looking for a needle in this particular haystack, a Royal Vulpine stasis pod. Our sensors tracked its trajectory to this coordinate 3 hours ago. Where is it, Grease Monkey?" "You and every other Iron Pants in the sector," Kaelen spat, leaning against the workbench. "I saw a pod drift past 4 hours ago. It was caught in a magnetic eddy near the Silas Prime gravity well. If you want it, go fish it out of the gas giant. I'm just here to fix conduits." "Liar," one of the cleaners said, kicking over a stack of hole plating. The metal clattered loudly, the sound echoing into the vents. In my internal audio sensors, I picked up a sharp, involuntary intake of breath from the ventilation shaft. Mika, the youngest, had flinched. "A 9, Kaelen whispered through the subdermal link. "Engaging diversion," I responded. I triggered a localized overload in the station's secondary power grid. In the corner of the workshop, a junction box exploded in a shower of brilliant blue sparks. A thick, acrid cloud of smoke began to pour from the ceiling, and the station's automated alarm system began to shriek. A piercing, high-frequency wail that covered the sound of the Vulpine children shifting in the vents. "Fubar!" "Aharu," Kaelen yelled, acting the part of the panicked mechanic. "The magnetic shielding is collapsing. You overcharged the docking clamps, you idiots. We're going to lose pressure in Sector 4. The cleaners didn't flinch. They were trained for chaos. But Vance looked annoyed. He watched as Kaelen scrambled to the junction box, beating back the sparks with a fire-suppressant blanket. "Check the cargo logs," Vance commanded his sergeant. "The logs are a mess, sir," the sergeant replied, his voice crackling through the comms. "It's all handwritten entries and corrupted data. This man is a caveman living in a tin can." Vance walked toward the ventilation grate, the very one where Luma was currently holding her brother and sister in the dark. My processors spiked. The probability of discovery was climbing to 94%. "There's a residue here," Vance said, kneeling by the vent. He reached out a gloved finger, touching a faint, shimmering violet smear on the metal. "Kitsunari stasis gas. Smells like flowers and treason." Kalen's grip on the fire blanket tightened. I saw his heart rate climb for the first time in 10 years. He wasn't a scavenger anymore. The Vanguard was waking up. He was calculating the distance to his rifle, the angle of the sergeant's neck, and the most efficient way to put the hydro spanner through Vance's visor. "I told you," Kaelen said, his voice becoming dangerously steady. "The pod drifted past. It probably vented gas when it hit the debris field. That vent pulls in external atmosphere when the scrubbers are low. It's recycled air, Commander. You're sniffing the ghost of a ship that's already been crushed by the giant." Vance stood up slowly. He looked at Kaelen for a long, agonizing minute. The silence in the workshop was so thick it felt physical. I prepared my self-destruct sequence, knowing that if Kaelen went loud, I had to ensure the Justicar didn't leave this sector with the children. "You have a very specific way of standing, mechanic," Vance said softly. "You look like a man who has spent a lot of time in a trench." "I've spent a lot of time under heavy engines," Kaelen replied. "Makes you stiff. Makes you hate people who interrupt your work." Vance tilted his head. "I think you're a coward. I think you found that pod, saw the Sunstrider crest, and realized you didn't have the stones to handle the fallout. You probably shoved it back into the void rather than risk Silas Thorne's wrath." "Think whatever helps you sleep at night," Kaelen grumbled. "Just get your boots off my deck." Vance signaled his men. They began to pull back toward the airlock. "Keep the station on lockdown, Sergeant. If he tries to jump, vaporize the ship. We'll do a more thorough sweep once we've checked the gravity well. If I find out you lied to me, Grease Monkey, I won't just kill you. I'll make sure you're conscious when I feed you to the scrap shredder." The airlock hissed shut. The Justicar detached with a violent lurch, its thrusters scorching our hull as it pulled away into the debris field. Kaelen didn't move for 3 minutes. He stood by the smoking junction box, the fire blanket still in his hand, his eyes fixed on the empty airlock. Only when I confirmed that the interceptor had entered a stealth hold pattern 200 kilometers away did he finally exhale. "They're still watching, boss," I transmitted. "They're hovering in the radar shadow of the dead destroyer, waiting for us to make a move." Kaelen pulled off his welding mask. Sweat and grease had turned his face into a mask of war. He walked over to the ventilation grate and ripped it open with a single, violent heave. "Out," he said. Luma tumbled out first, her blue fur matted with dust. Ren followed, his violet eyes wide with terror, and Mika was clutched in his arms, her white tail trembling so hard it made a rattling sound against the floor. "They were humans," Luma whispered, her amber eyes burning with a mixture of fear and betrayal. "They had the same mark as you. They wanted to kill us." "They weren't humans," Kaelen said, his voice rougher than I had ever heard it. He looked at the grease on his hands, then at the children. "They were soldiers. There's a difference, kid. One has a choice. The other just has orders." "And you?" Luma challenged, stepping in front of her siblings. "Which are you?" Kaelen looked at the hydrospanner in his hand, then tossed it onto the workbench with a heavy clang. "Right now, I'm a mechanic who's about to break every law in the Confederacy to keep 3 tail draggers from becoming a footnote in Silas Thorne's biography. Now get to the galley. A9, prep the decoy. If Thorne wants to hunt a pod, let's give him one that's rigged with 3 dozen magnetic mines and a very nasty surprise." Swerve. As the children scurried toward the back of the ship, Kaelen sat on a crate, his head in his hands. I moved my optical lens to focus on him. "Probability of survival has decreased to 5%, boss," I noted. "Shut up, A9, he muttered. "I'm thinking. I am also detecting an unusual biofeedback loop in your system. It appears you are experiencing protective impulses." Kaelen looked up at me, his eyes tired but sharp. "I'm just tired of burying things, A9. Especially things that are still small enough to fit in a vent. Now get to work. We've got a long night of cheating ahead of us." The reliquary was not a vessel built for silence. It was a symphony of groans, clicks, and the rhythmic thud of the oxygen scrubbers. But after the departure of the Justicar, the silence inside the ship felt like a vacuum. The children sat in the galley, huddled together on a single bench designed for one human. They looked like a cluster of fallen stars against the rust and industrial grime of the interior. Kaelen was in the engine room, his back pressed against the heat shielding of the primary reactor. I hovered nearby, my diagnostic sensors scanning the fluctuating power levels. The decoy pod, a pressurized oxygen tank he had modified with a Vulpine transponder, was ready in the launch tube. "Boss," I transmitted, "the children are staring at the ration bars again. I believe they are attempting to use psionic resonance to make them taste like something other than cardboard." "Let 'em," Kaelen grumbled. He was working on a magnetic coupling, his fingers moving with a precision that contradicted his scarred, heavy appearance. "Better they use their brains for that than for trying to melt my brain through the bulkhead." "Luma's asking for you," I added. Kaelen paused. He looked at the wrench in his hand, then at the grease-stained deck. "She's the smart one. That's the dangerous part. The smart ones always want to know why." He stood up, his spine clicking with the sound of a mechanical lock, and walked toward the galley. I followed, my thrusters silent. Luma was standing by the table, her sky-blue fur glowing faintly in the dim lighting. Ren and Mika were asleep, their bushy tails intertwined for warmth. Luma looked at Kaelen, her amber eyes searching his face for a lie she expected to find. "You could have given us to them," she said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. 2,000 credits for a repair. 3 Royal Sunstriders would have bought you a planet. Why didn't you sell us? Kaelen pulled out a stool and sat down opposite her. He looked older in this light, the shadows accentuating the deep lines around his mouth. "I don't like the color of Confederacy money anymore, kid. It all looks like blood to me." "But you were one of them," Luma pressed, her ears twitching. "I see the mark. Vanguard. My mother told me stories of the Vanguard. She said they were the ones who didn't stop until the world was ash." Kaelen reached up, rubbing the winged skull tattoo behind his ear. "Your mother was right. most of the time. But even a machine breaks if you push it too hard. I broke 10 years ago on a rock called Velas. They told me to burn a sector. I looked at the scanner and saw that the military targets were wearing school uniforms. So I didn't pull the trigger. And then I spent the next decade hiding in this graveyard so I wouldn't have to look at men like Silas Thorne again. Luma stared at him. The Vulpine were sensitive to emotional resonance. She wasn't just hearing his words, she was feeling the weight of the grief he carried. I registered a ripple in the psionic field, a soft, empathetic vibration that shimmered through the air like heat. "You are a broken soldier," she whispered. "I'm a mechanic," Kaelen corrected her sharply. "And if you're going to stay on this ship, you're going to be one too. We don't have passengers on the reliquary. We have crew. If Thorne comes back, I can't be everywhere at once. You need to know how to talk to this ship." He reached out and grabbed a spare power coupling from his belt, sliding it across the table toward her. "This is the heart of the magnetic shield. If the lights go red, you jam this into the socket in Sector 3 and twist it 3 times to the right. If you don't, the radiation from the debris field will cook you from the inside out. You got that?" Luma looked at the piece of technology. Her people used crystalline psionics, but Kaelen's world was one of heavy alloys and electrical currents. She picked up the coupling, her clawed fingers feeling the weight of the metal. "Twist 3 times to the right," she repeated. "Good. Now come here." For the next 3 hours, Kaelen led the eldest Vulpine through the guts of the ship. He didn't use the language of diplomacy or the language of war. He used the language of the wrench. He showed her how to bypass a blown fuse with a piece of copper wire. He taught her the thump of a healthy reactor versus the hiss of a leaking cooling line. I watched the data. The probability of Luma becoming a functional technician was surprisingly high. Vulpine brains were optimized for pattern recognition. What Kaelen saw as mechanical systems, she saw as a flow of energy, not unlike the psionic currents of her homeworld. "Why do you fix things that are already dead?" Wren asked, having woken up and followed them into the workshop. He was pointing at a stack of salvaged engine parts. "In the ossuary, nothing is ever truly dead, kid," Kaelen said, wiping a smudge of oil from Wren's nose with a surprisingly gentle thumb. "It's just waiting for someone to give it a new purpose. A ship can be blown into 1,000 pieces, but the parts remember what they were meant to be. You just have to remind them." Wren looked at the engine part, then at Kaelen. "Are we like the parts?" Kaelen froze. He looked at the boy, then at the girl, then at the tiny Mika who was now playing with a pile of magnetic washers on the floor. He saw the royal Vulpine heirs, the children who were supposed to be the future of a galaxy-spanning empire, now living in a junkyard, eating cardboard bars and learning how to twist couplings. "Yeah," Kaelen said softly, "I guess you are. You're just waiting for a new purpose." The moment of quiet was shattered by a proximity alarm. "Boss," I announced, my voice cutting through the workshop. "The Justicar is moving. They've finished their sweep of the gravity well. They're heading back toward us, and this time, they're not running cold. They've got their weapons pre-charged." Kaelen's face snapped back into the Vanguard mask. "A9, status on the decoy?" "Launch ready, boss. I have synchronized the transponder to mimic the Sunstrider energy signature perfectly." "Launch it," Kaelen commanded. "Aim it toward the black hole sector. If Thorne follows it, he'll be trapped in the event horizon's shadow for at least 6 hours." I triggered the release. The modified oxygen tank shot out of the launch tube, its violet beacon pulsing with a royal frequency that was a siren song for Silas Thorne. On the radar, I watched the Justicar pivot, its engines flaring with a brilliant white light as it gave chase to the ghost of the children. "They took the bait," I reported. "Good," Kaelen said. He turned to the kids. "We have 6 hours. We're going to the Void Stitch. It's a tear in space-time on the edge of the ossuary. If we can sew our way through, we'll be in the neutral zone before dawn." "The Void Stitch?" Luma whispered, her ears pinning back against her head. "My mother says only the mad go there. The space is broken. It screams." "I told you, kid," Kaelen said, grabbing the flight yoke as he sat in the pilot's chair. "I'm a mechanic. I know how to fix things that scream. Now get to your stations. A9, divert all power to the thrusters. We're going to burn this engine until it glows." As the reliquary surged forward, leaving the safety of the debris field, I calculated the odds one more time. The Void Stitch was a navigational nightmare. a region of space where the laws of physics were merely suggestions. The probability of survival was 2%. But then I looked at Kaelen. He wasn't looking at the sensors. He was looking at Luma, who was standing by the coupling in Sector 3, her hand gripped tight around the metal, her eyes focused and ready. "A 9, Kaelen said, his voice quiet. "Yes, boss? Update the survival probability." I ran the numbers again. Taking into account the increased efficiency of the auxiliary crew, the probability is now 12%. Kaelen grinned, a real fierce Vanguard grin. 12%? Hell, that's almost a sure thing. Punch it. Sonars. The ship roared, the stars outside beginning to stretch into lines of white fire as we dove toward the broken heart of the galaxy. Kaelen Vane had spent 10 years running from his past, but as he drove his rusted ship toward the edge of the universe to save 3 children of his former enemy, I realized he was no longer running. He was hunting a future. The Void Stitch was not a place. It was a scream caught in a throat of gravity. As the reliquary approached the coordinates, my optical sensors began to fracture, the data streams pixelating into kaleidoscopic ribbons of impossible color. The Ossuary was a graveyard of metal, but the Void Stitch was a graveyard of physics. Here, the boundaries between the now and the then were thin enough to bleed. "Boss," I transmitted, my voice modulated to cut through the increasing static of the cabin. "Hull integrity is down to 78%. The gravitational shear is attempting to unscrew every bolt in the engine room. If we don't hit the event horizon at exactly 45 degrees, we won't be sewn through space. We'll be unspooled like old yarn." Kaelen Vane didn't look at the monitors. He was hunched over the flight yoke, his eyes bloodshot, his knuckles white against the dark leather. The integrated spinal struts in his back were whirring, a high-pitched, frantic sound that told me his own body was fighting the tidal forces. "I know the math, A9, Kaelen gritted out. His voice was a dry rasp. "Just keep the reactors from going supernova." "Luma, report." In the engine corridor, Luma was braced against a bulkhead, her sky-blue fur standing on end from the static charge filling the ship. She clutched the power coupling Kaelen had given her. "The lights are flickering amber, Jonah. The thump is turning into a rattle." "Twist the coupling," Kaelen roared over the shriek of the hull. "Give the magnetic shield more juice. Don't think about the heat, just feel the rhythm." "It burns," the girl cried out. "Life's a burn, kid. Hold the line." I watched Mika and Ren through the internal cameras. They were huddled in the corner of the workshop, wrapped in a heavy fire-suppressant blanket. Mika's azure eyes were wide, reflecting the strobing red emergency lights. Ren was holding her tight, his violet fur damp with sweat. They weren't just terrified, they were experiencing the psionic backlash of a space that hated consciousness. To a Vulpine, the Void Stitch was a psychic blender. "Boss," I noted, "the children's neural readings are spiking into the danger zone. The Stitch is feeding on their psionic resonance. If we don't exit within 3 minutes, their brains will flatline from sensory overload." Kalen's jaw tightened so hard I heard a tooth crack. "We're going in. Hang on to your brass, everyone. It's about to get real ugly." The ship dove. The Void Stitch swallowed us whole. Inside the Stitch, time ceased to be a linear progression and became a chaotic soup. I registered Kalen's heart rate jumping to 140 beats per minute. My own logic gates began to loop. I saw Kaelen not as a man of 52 years, but as a boy of 7 holding a toy soldier, and then as a ghost of 80 years old fading into the vacuum. "Jonah," Luma's voice echoed through the comms, but it sounded like it was coming from 1,000 kilometers away in a decade in the past. "Everything is blue. I can see the ship's heart. It's crying." "That's the reactor, little slink," Kaelen shouted. His face was contorted in agony as the metal fused to his spine hummed in sympathy with the rift. "Talk to it. Tell it we're just passing through." In that moment, the humanistic data I had been collecting for years reached a critical mass. Kaelen Vane, the man who had spent 10 years claiming he wanted to die alone in the dark, was pouring his own life force into the ship's controls to shield 3 children of a race he was supposed to hate. He wasn't acting like a soldier following a mission. He was acting like an anchor. I can't hold it," Luma screamed. The power coupling in her hand erupted in a spray of violet sparks. Kaelen unbuckled his harness. The gravity was shifting, tossing him against the ceiling of the cockpit. He scrambled toward the engine room, his movements a desperate, violent crawl. I watched as he reached Luma, his large, grease-stained hand slamming down over hers on the coupling. "Together, kid!" Kaelen barked. The sheer heat of the coupling began to melt the skin of his palm. I could smell the ozone and the scent of searing flesh. 1, 2, twist! The magnetic shield flared into a blinding white wall. The screaming of the stitch reached a crescendo, a sound like a billion crystal glasses shattering at once. And then, silence. The reliquary tumbled out into the neutral zone. We were drifting, the engines dead, the interior lights reduced to a dull, dying crimson. "Status," Kaelen wheezed. He was slumped against the bulkhead, his hand a ruined mass of blisters and black soot. Luma was shaking beside him, her amber eyes unfocused. "We have emerged, boss," I replied, my own systems rebooting. Location, Sector 904, the neutral zone. Distance from the Ossuary, 3,000 light-years. We have sewn the gap. However, the ship is dead in the water. We have 3 hours of oxygen remaining, and the reactor core is cooling into a brick. Kaelen looked at Luma. She was staring at his burned hand, her ears drooping. A single tear tracked through the soot on her cheek. "You did it, kid," Kaelen whispered. He tried to ruffle the fur on her head with his good hand, but he was too weak. He slid down to the floor, his eyes fluttering. "You held the line." "Why did you do it?" Luma whispered, her voice trembling. "You burned yourself for us. We are just slinks. That's what you called us." Kaelen closed his eyes. A small, tired smile touched his lips. "Call it a career change. I'm tired of being a monster, Luma. I'd rather be a mechanic." He went unconscious. "Boss? Kaelen?" I activated my external floodlights, scanning the darkness of the neutral zone. There was nothing out here but cold stars in the silence of the void. "Ren, Mika," I called out over the ship's speakers. "Your sister and the boss are incapacitated. I require assistance in the engine room. Bring the first aid kit, the one marked with the red cross, and hurry. The probability of us surviving the next hour is currently dropping towards 0. The 2 younger children emerged from the workshop, their tails tucked between their legs. But as they saw Kaelen lying on the deck, something changed. The fear didn't vanish, but it was overridden by a new, emerging pattern. They didn't run away. They ran toward the man who had pulled them from the pod. "Jonah!" Mika cried, throwing herself onto Kaelen's chest. Ren grabbed the first aid kit, his small hands trembling as he fumbled with the latches. "A 9, what do we do? Tell us what to do." "Apply the dermal mesh to his hand, Ren," I instructed, my processors whirring. "Mika, keep his head elevated. We need to keep him breathing until I can jumpstart the scrubbers." I watched them work. 3 children of the Sunstrider royalty, heirs to an empire of psionic fire, kneeling in the dirt and grease of a human scavenger ship, trying to save a man who had once been their greatest nightmare. The turning point was no longer a mathematical probability, it was a reality. The soldier was gone. The mechanic was broken. But for the first time in my existence, the reliquary felt like more than a collection of parts. It felt like a home. "Boss," I whispered through the comms, though he couldn't hear me. "Update to survival probability. 15%. Because they aren't just parts anymore. They're choosing to be a family." 2 hours and 40 minutes had passed since our exit from the void stitch. The oxygen levels in the reliquary were holding at 12%, a thin, metallic-tasting atmosphere that made every breath a labor for the biologicals. Kaelen was still unconscious, his hand wrapped in a crude layer of dermal mesh, his face pale beneath the grime. Ren and Mika had fallen asleep again, exhausted by the psionic toll and the thin air, curled up against Kaelen's legs like 2 pups guarding an old wolf. Only Luma remained awake. She was sitting at the navigation console, her amber eyes staring out into the dark. "A 9, she whispered. "Is it always this quiet in the neutral zone?" "Quiet is relative, Luma," I replied. "To a machine, the void is full of the hum of cosmic background radiation. To a human, it is a tomb. To a Vulpine, I do not have the data. It feels like waiting," she said. She reached out, her clawed finger tracing the glass of the viewport. like the stars are holding their breath. She was right. My sensors picked up a distortion in the local space-time fabric. It wasn't the jagged, violent rift of the void stitch. This was smooth, deliberate, and immense. A void fold, the signature of high-tier Vulpine warp technology. "Luma," I barked, my voice snapping the girl into alertness. "Wake the children. Move Kaelen to the shielded bunk. Now." "What is it? Is it Thorn?" "No, it's bigger, much bigger." Space in front of the reliquary didn't just open. It folded like a piece of silver paper. A ship emerged. It was 300 meters of white kinetic glass and gold-etched dragon plates. It didn't look like a vessel. It looked like a frozen lightning bolt. The Silver Fang, the flagship of the Vulpine matriarchy. "It's Mother!" Luma gasped, her fur fluffing up in a mixture of joy and sudden, sharp terror. The Silver Fang didn't wait for a hail. It didn't offer a greeting. It fired its tractor beam, a solid shaft of violet psionic energy that locked onto our rusted hull with the force of a tectonic plate. The reliquary groaned, the metal screaming as we were hauled toward the massive warship like a fly caught by a spider. "Docking initiated," I reported. "Magnetic seals engaging. Boss is still out. Luma, you need to be the one who talks to them." The airlock hissed. This wasn't the sterile lavender of the Confederacy. It was the smell of burning cedar, ozone, and ancient power. The blast doors opened, and a squad of Vulpine vanguards, the Ghost Walkers, stepped through. They wore white armor that shimmered with psionic fields, their eyes glowing with a cold blue fire. At their center was matriarch Valeriana. She was a goddess of war, 7 feet of snowy white fur, 3 massive tails swirling behind her like a storm, and eyes that held the weight of 1,000 suns. She looked at the rusted, grease-stained interior of our ship with a disgust that was palpable. "Where are they?" she spoke, her voice a telepathic thunderclap that made the deck plates vibrate. Luma stepped forward, her legs shaking. "Mother, we are here!" Valeriana's gaze swept over Luma, then landed on Ren and Mika, who were peeking out from behind the bunk. Her expression shifted for a fraction of a second, a mother's relief, before hardening into a mask of regal fury. Then she saw Kaelen. He was still on the floor, his burned hand visible, his breathing shallow. Valeriana's tails snapped forward, the fur on them crackling with golden lightning. "Human," she hissed. Her hand moved to the hilt of the dragon glass blade at her hip. "Vanguard scum, you dare lay your filthy hands upon the house of Sunstrider? You dare kidnap the heirs of the matriarchy?" "Mother, no!" Luma cried, throwing herself between Valeriana and the unconscious Kaelen. "He didn't kidnap us. He saved us." Valeriana paused, her blade halfway out of its sheath. The Ghost Walkers tightened their grip on their psionic spears. "Saved you?" Valeriana's voice was like ice. "He is a human, a scavenger. Look at this bucket of rust. He kept you in a cage of metal and oil." "He pulled us from the pod," Ren shouted, standing up and pointing a finger at the Queen. "The Iron Fangs tried to kill us. Thorn's men tried to take us. Jonah fought them. He burned his hand to keep the ship from blowing up." Valeriana looked at Kaelen's ruined hand. She looked at the dermal mesh, the crude human medicine applied with shaking, Vulpine hands. She looked at me, my small drone body hovering in the corner. "A 9!" Kaelen's voice crackled. It was weak, barely a whisper, but it cut through the tension like a knife. He was awake. He was struggling to sit up, his eyes unfocused. He saw the white-armored soldiers, and he saw Valeriana. He didn't reach for his gun. He didn't even flinch. He just looked at her with the tired, cynical gaze of a man who had seen too many queens and not enough people. "You the mom?" Kaelen wheezed. He coughed, a wet, rattling sound. "About time. Your kids are loud, and they don't like ration bars." Valeriana stepped closer, her presence overwhelming. She looked down at him, her golden eyes scanning his surface thoughts. "You are Kaelen Vane, the ghost of Sector 4. You are the man who refused the fire at Valey's." Kaelen's expression darkened. "History is a bitch, isn't it? Everyone remembers the one thing you didn't do." "I remember," Valeriana said softly. "My sister was in that sector. Because you stayed your hand, she lived to see the ceasefire." The lightning on her tails faded. She sheathed her blade with a sharp crystalline click. But the Iron Fang is still hunting my children, and Silas Thorne is not far behind. You have brought them to the neutral zone, human, but you have brought the storm with you. Boss, I reported, my sensors screaming a new warning. Warp signatures detected. Multiple. Confederacy configurations. Thorne has followed our trail through the Void Stitch. He's not playing decoy anymore. He's brought a battle group. Valeriana turned toward the viewport. Outside, 3 Confederacy destroyers and the Justicar emerged from the darkness. They were already launching their drone swarms. Thorne, Kaelen spat, pulling himself to his feet with Luma's help. That bastard never knows when to quit. Valeriana looked at Kaelen, then at her children, who were now clinging to Luma's blue robes. She saw the way they looked at the human, not with fear, but with a desperate need for him to be okay. We cannot fight them here, Valeriana said, her voice becoming the matriarch again. My ship is optimized for speed and psionics, but against 4 Confederacy destroyers in open space, the children are at risk. They won't fire on the Silver Fang, Kaelen said, leaning against the console. Not yet. Thorne needs a reason. He needs to make it look like you started it. He's waiting for a shot. Then we give him something else to look at, I suggested. Boss, if we vent the remaining fuel from the reliquary and ignite it with the psionic pulse from the matriarch's flagship, we can create a nebula of ionized gas. It will blind their targeting sensors for 20 minutes. Kaelen looked at his ship, his rusted, battered home. It'll destroy the engines, A9. We'll be a sitting duck. We are already a sitting duck, boss, I noted. Now we just have the option of being a sitting duck with a smokescreen. Kaelen looked at Valeriana. You heard the bucket of bolts. Can your ship handle a blind jump? Valeriana nodded, a new respect in her eyes. We can jump, but your ship will be lost, Kaelen Vane. Why would you give up your home for a race that is not your own? Kaelen looked at the kids. Mika was holding his thumb again. Ren was watching him with wide violet eyes. Luma was standing tall, her hand on the power coupling she had learned to use. It's just a ship, Highness, Kaelen said, his voice rough but sure. I can always find more junk, but I only get one chance to not be a monster. A9, prep the fuel vent. Luma, get to the bunk. Matriarch, if you lose my kids, I'll find a way to hack your flagship and turn the lights pink. I swear it on my knees. Valeriana let out a short, sharp laugh, a sound of genuine amusement. A formidable threat, Guardian. Very well. Let us show this Silas Thorne how a human and a foxkin burn the sky together. The reliquary began to groan as its fuel lines were ripped open. The Silver Fang's gold-etched hull began to pulse with a terrifying violet light. Outside, the Confederacy battle group closed in, unaware that they were about to be blinded by the most expensive smokescreen in the history of the galaxy. As the children were ushered into the matriarch's ship, Luma stopped at the airlock. She looked back at Kaelen, who was standing alone on the bridge of his dying ship, a silhouette of grease and scars against the stars. Come with us, Jonah, she pleaded. Kaelen shook his head. Someone has to pull the trigger on the fuel vent, kid. I'll meet you on the other side. A9 will stay with me. He's too annoying to leave behind. You better come, she hissed, baring her teeth one last time, or I'll come back and bite you. I'm counting on it, Kaelen smiled. The airlock hissed shut. The reliquary was alone in the dark, a small, rusted anchor in a storm of golden glass. A9, Kaelen said, sitting in the pilot's chair. Yes, boss? Status on the fuel vent. Ready, boss. On your mark. Kaelen looked out at the Justicar, the ship that had chased him for 10 years. He reached out and touched the winged skull tattoo behind his ear. Mark, he whispered. The sky erupted. The universe did not end in a whimper. It ended in a roar of ignited promethium and the indignant shriek of tearing hull plates. As the narrator of this sequence, my optical sensors recorded the exact microsecond Kaelen Vane depressed the manual vent override. In that instant, the reliquary, a vessel that had been Kaelen's fortress, his sanctuary, and his penance for over 10 years, became a localized supernova. The high-octane fuel meant to bridge the gap between star systems expanded into a blinding nebula of ionized orange fire, catching the psionic pulse from the Silver Fang and magnifying it into a wall of sensory interference that effectively deleted our sector from every radar screen in the Confederacy fleet. I felt the shock wave first as a kinetic hammer blow against my chassis. My internal gyroscope spun into a frantic correction loop. Kaelen was thrown from the pilot's chair like a rag doll, his body impacting the reinforced bulkhead with a sound that made my diagnostic subroutines spike in alarm. His biometrics were a chaotic mess of red: 3 fractured ribs, a grade 4 concussion, and a heart rate that fluttered like a trapped bird. "Boss," I transmitted, my voice warbling through the electromagnetic storm. "Internal atmosphere is at 40% and dropping. The bridge is compromised. We are drifting into the maw." Kaelen didn't answer. He lay in a heap of grease and shredded ceramic armor, his good hand still twitching as if searching for a wrench that was no longer there. Outside, the smokescreen worked with a terrifying efficiency. Through the swirling fire, I saw the silhouettes of the Confederacy destroyers. They were blind, their sophisticated targeting computers choking on the mixture of burnt fuel and Vulpine psychic residue. But the Justicar was different. Silas Thorne's flagship possessed a legacy sensor array, vacuum-hardened and manually calibrated. It didn't need a computer to tell it where the heart of the explosion was. A boarding harpoon, 3 meters of jagged tungsten, punched through our viewport. The reinforced glass, designed to withstand asteroid impacts, shattered into a million diamond-sharp shards. The vacuum of space began to howl, pulling the heat and the remaining air out of the bridge. "Emergency seals!" I shrieked, though there was no one to hear me but the ghosts. I deployed my magnetic tethers, anchoring myself to the floor and wrapping a secondary line around Kaelen's waist. I dragged him toward the airlock, my thrusters fighting the atmospheric decompression. We were halfway there when the Justicar's boarding party breached the hull. 4 figures in matte black armor dropped through the jagged hole in the ceiling. They didn't move like soldiers. They moved like predators who had already won. Silas Thorne stepped down last. He didn't wear a helmet. He didn't need one. He carried a localized atmospheric bubble generator on his belt, a piece of tech so expensive it could buy a dozen salvage stations. His silver hair was perfectly groomed, his eyes cold and gray as a winter sea. He looked down at Kaelen with a mixture of pity and profound disgust. "Kaelen Vane," Thorne said, his voice amplified to cut through the roar of the venting air. "Look at you, the great ghost of Sector 4, reduced to a muck dweller in a sinking tin can. You always did have a penchant for the dramatic, but this is just pathetic." He gestured to his men. One of them stepped forward and kicked Kaelen in the ribs. Kaelen groaned, his eyes fluttering open for a brief second before the pain dragged him back down. "Where are the slinks, Kaelen?" Thorne asked, leaning down. He grabbed Kaelen by the collar, lifting him effortlessly. "I know they were here. I can smell the ozone on your skin. Did you think a little smoke and a Vulpine queen would be enough to hide them from me?" Kaelen coughed, a spray of dark blood hitting Thorne's pristine collar. A tired, jagged smile touched his lips. "They're gone, Silas. Sewn into the dark. You're chasing echoes." Thorne's expression didn't change, but his grip tightened until Kaelen's neck turned a bruised purple. "You've always been a sentimental fool. You threw away a career for a school of Vulpine brats 10 years ago, and now you've thrown away your life for 3 more. Blood is the only currency that matters in this galaxy, Vane. Loyalty to your own kind. You betrayed your species the day you stayed your hand at Velis." "My species?" Kaelen wheezed. "You and the cleaners. You aren't my kind. You're just the rot." Thorne dropped him. Kaelen hit the deck hard. Thorne turned his gaze toward me, his eyes narrowing as he analyzed my scavenger markings. "A 9. A Vanguard-issue tactical drone, repurposed for scrap. Fitting. Sergeant, secure the drone. I want its memory banks. I want to see every microsecond of their journey. If the children are on the matriarch's ship, we'll use the human as leverage. Valeriana has a weakness for noble gestures. Let's see how much she values the life of her pet mechanic." I tried to initiate my self-destruct sequence, but a localized EMP burst from one of the soldiers, hit me squarely in the logic core. My world turned to static. The last thing I recorded was Kaelen being dragged across the shattered glass toward the Justicar, his blood leaving a trail of dark rubies on the floor of the ship he had died to save. When my systems rebooted, I was no longer in the ossuary. I was clamped to a diagnostic rack in the bowels of the Justicar. The room was a sterile, white-tilted nightmare of Confederacy interrogation tech. Beside me, strapped into a neural inhibitor chair, was Kaelen. They had stripped him of his armor. His torso was a map of the war, jagged shrapnel scars across his chest, the long surgical seam where the metal had been fused to his spine, and the fresh, angry burns on his hands. He looked smaller without the grease in the gear. He looked like a man who had been running for 100 years and had finally run out of road. "Boss," I whispered through our private frequency. Kalen's head drifted up. His eyes were clouded with the haze of neural suppressants. "A 9. You still ticking, scraphead?" "Integrity at 64%, boss. They are attempting to crack my encryption. It will take them 4 hours to bypass the Vanguard firewalls." "Make it 5, Kaelen grunted. He winced as the inhibitor chair sent a low-frequency pulse through his nerves. "I need a minute." The door slid open and Silas Thorne walked in, accompanied by Commander Vance. Thorne held a datapad, scrolling through the preliminary scans of my memory. "You've been busy, Kaelen, protecting royalty, teaching a Vulpine girl how to bypass Confederacy power grids. You've turned those children into weapons." "I taught them how to fix things," Kaelen said, his voice stronger now, though it carried a tremor of agony. "Something you never learned, Silas. You only know how to break." "I am securing the future of humanity," Thorne roared, slamming the pad onto the table. "The ceasefire is a slow death. The Vulpine breed faster, think faster, and their psionics are an evolutionary threat we cannot ignore. We need a war to cull them before they become our masters. And those 3 children, the Sunstrider heirs, are the perfect spark. If they die in a Kitsunari extremist attack, the Confederacy will have no choice but to launch a full-scale purge." Kaelen looked at Thorne with a clarity that seemed to bypass the drugs. "You don't care about humanity, Silas. You care about the contracts, the hull plating, the fuel. You're just a scavenger with a bigger ship." Thorne leaned in, his face inches from Kalen's. "And you? What are you? You're a man without a home, without a people, and now without a ship. You gave everything to a race that will forget your name in a week. Was it worth it?" Kaelen looked at his burned hand, then at the empty air where Mika had once clutched his thumb. "Yeah," he said softly. "It was. Because for the first time in 20 years, I don't see the ghost when I close my eyes. I see a future," Thorne sneered. "Then you can die for it. Vance, prep the transmission. We're calling the Silver Fang. Let's see if Valeriana is as motherly as the reports say. If she doesn't hand over the children within the hour, we'll vent Kaelen Vane into the vacuum of Sector 9. One human life for the peace of the galaxy? It's an easy trade." As Thorne walked out, the silence of the room was broken only by the hum of the inhibitors. I watched Kaelen, my internal processors screaming for a solution that didn't exist. "Boss," I said, "the probability of rescue is—" "0, A9, Kaelen interrupted. He looked at me, and for the first time the Vanguard mask was gone completely. He looked at peace. "But that's okay. We did the job. The kids are safe. That's the only math that matters." But as I monitored the long-range sensors of the Justicar, I saw something Thorne hadn't accounted for. A ripple in the void fold. A signature that wasn't a ship, but a scream of collective fury. The matriarch wasn't running. She was coming back. And she wasn't alone. The rescue did not begin with a cannon blast. It began with an illusion. Inside the interrogation room, the sterile white walls suddenly began to bleed color. It started at the corners, a soft emerald green that shimmered like sunlight through leaves. I registered a psionic surge so powerful it made the Justicar's internal sensors moan in digital pain. The scent of crushed lavender and wet earth filled the air, overriding the smell of ozone and antiseptic. Kaelen Vane lifted his head, his eyes widening. "Luma? Stay quiet, Jonah," a voice whispered in his mind. It wasn't the matriarch's thunder. It was the melodic, determined hum of the girl who had learned the language of the wrench. On the bridge of the Justicar, Absolute chaos erupted. My access to the ship's internal network was limited, but I could hear the panicked shouts of the crew through the vents. "Multiple contacts, Sector 0, a voice yelled over the intercom. It's, it's an ancestral forest? Sir, the radar is showing trees." Silas Thorne's voice was a snarl. "It's a psionic cloak. Fire everything. Blind fire if you have to." The Justicar bucked as its primary batteries opened fire on empty space. Outside, the Vulpine fleet had engaged, but they weren't fighting like a traditional navy. They were void-stitching in and out of reality, appearing as flashes of silver and gold before vanishing back into the shadows. At the center of the storm was the Silver Fang, its hull glowing with a violet radiance that looked like a physical sun. But the real threat wasn't the ships, it was the children. Luma, Ren, and Mika had been training their psionics since birth, but Kaelen had given them something the royal tutors never could: a focus on the mechanical. I watched through a hijacked security camera as the Justicar's primary reactor began to fail. It wasn't being hit by missiles. It was being disassembled from the inside. Ren was using his violet eyes to perceive the flow of electrons in the ship's power conduits, nudging them into feedback loops. Mika was projecting a localized cold spot onto the cooling lines, causing them to fracture. And Luma was the bridge. She was weaving their efforts together, her mind a symphony of sabotage that mirrored the way Kaelen had taught her to fix the reliquary. The door to our interrogation room exploded, not from a grenade but from a concentrated psionic blast that turned the reinforced steel into shrapnel. Matriarch Valeriana stepped through the smoke. She was a vision of lethal elegance, her white fur stained with the blood of the guards she had dismantled in the hallway. Behind her, Luma was sweating, her amber eyes glowing with an intensity that suggested she was holding the ship's entire internal security system at bay. "Guardian," Valeriana spoke, her voice a telepathic embrace. "We have come to settle the debt." Kaelen struggled against the neural inhibitor chair. You were supposed to stay in the neutral zone. You're starting a war, Valeriana." "No," the Queen said, her hand moving to the hilt of her blade. "We are finishing one. Luma refused to leave you. She said that a family does not leave its members in a trench. I found her argument persuasive." Luma ran forward, her small hands fumbling with the controls of Kaelen's chair. She didn't use her powers this time. She used a human multi-tool she had scavenged from Kaelen's belt during the escape. She jammed the driver into the override port and twisted. "3 times to the right, Jonah," she cried out, her voice cracking. I remembered the rhythm." The inhibitors hissed and released. Kaelen fell forward, his knees buckling. Valeriana caught him, her massive white arms supporting his weight. She looked at him, a human who had been beaten and broken for her children. And the centuries of prejudice in her gaze vanished, replaced by a fierce, protective kinship. "Can you walk, ghost of Sector 4? She asked. Kaelen looked at Luma, then at Ren and Mika, who were standing in the doorway, their tails bushy and defiant. He looked at the matriarch. He felt the pain in his back, the burn in his hand, and the heavy weight of his 52 years. But he also felt a surge of something he hadn't felt since before the war. "I've spent 10 years sitting down, Highness," Kaelen rasped, grabbing his kinetic rifle from a nearby locker. "I think it's time I stood up for something." The escape from the Justicar was a running battle through a labyrinth of shifting realities. Luma maintained the forest illusion, turning the sterile corridors into a maze of ghostly vines and blinding fireflies. The cleaners were paralyzed by fear, firing at shadows while Kaelen and the Vulpine vanguards moved through them like smoke. We reached the hangar bay just as Silas Thorne arrived with the last of his personal guard. He was desperate now, his silver hair disheveled, his pulse shredder leveled at the group. "You won't leave this ship," Thorne screamed. "If I can't have the peace of the grave, I'll have the fire of the void. I've set the reactor to overload. We all burn together." Kaelen stepped forward, shielding the children with his own body. He looked at Thorne, not with anger, but with a profound, weary understanding. "You still don't get it, Silas. You think the galaxy is made of empires and borders? You think blood defines who we are? But look around you." He gestured to the Vulpine children holding his hand, and to the matriarch standing at his shoulder. "We chose this," Kaelen said. I'm not a soldier of the Confederacy. I'm not a ghost of the Vanguard. I'm a father who chose his kids. And there isn't a reactor in this galaxy big enough to burn that out of me. Thorne snarled and pulled the trigger. Kaelen didn't flinch. He didn't have to. Mika, the youngest, let out a piercing shriek, and a localized psionic shield flared into existence in front of Kaelen. The pulse rounds hit the shimmering violet wall and dissipated harmlessly. At the same time, Ren snapped his fingers. The cooling units in Thorne's atmospheric generator flashed, froze. Thorne gasped, his localized air bubble turning into a block of solid ice. He fell to his knees, clawing at his throat as the vacuum of the hangar began to leach the life from him. "A 9, Kaelen said, his voice calm. "Status on the reactor." "Ren and Luma have already bypassed the overload, boss," I reported, my sensors finally clear. "The Justicar is a brick. It is dead in the water." Kaelen looked down at the suffocating Thorne. He could have finished it. He could have put a round through Thorne's head and ended 10 years of nightmares. His finger hovered over the trigger of his rifle. The Vanguard screamed for justice. The soldiers screamed for blood. But Mika reached out and touched his hand. Her azure eyes were wide, pleading. Kaelen exhaled. He lowered the rifle. "Not today, Silas. Today, we choose life. You can stay here with your ship. Maybe someone will find you in 10 years and give you a purpose. But I doubt it." The group boarded the Matriarch's shuttle. As we pulled away from the Justicar, the Silver Fang fired a final, non-lethal psionic burst, disabling the Confederacy destroyers. The Vulpine fleet folded space, sowing themselves out of the neutral zone and back toward the ancestral systems. Inside the shuttle, the atmosphere was one of exhausted relief. Kaelen sat on the floor, Mika curled up in his lap, Ren leaning against his shoulder. Luma sat opposite him, holding the power coupling from the reliquary, the only piece of his old life that had survived the fire. Valeriana stood over them, her tail stilled. She looked at Kaelen for a long time. "The ceasefire is over, Kaelen Vane," she said quietly. "But the war will not be the one Silas Thorne intended. We have formed a new covenant, a third way. The Sunstrider systems will be a sanctuary for all who choose peace over blood, human or Vulpine." "Sounds like a lot of work, Highness," Kaelen grumbled, though his hand was gently stroking Mika's ears. "It is," Valeriana agreed. "And every sanctuary needs a guardian. Every ship needs a mechanic who knows how to fix things that scream." Kaelen looked out the viewport at the stars. They weren't holding their breath anymore. They were shining. "I'm going to need a bigger wrench," Kaelen said. Luma handed him the coupling. "I kept it for you, Jonah, for the next ship." Kaelen took the metal, his burned hand closing around it with a strength that defied his injuries. He looked at the girl, then at me. "Survival probability, A9?" he asked. I ran the data through my new expanded logic gates. I looked at the broken soldier, the warrior queen, and the children who had bridged the gap between species. 100%, boss, I replied. Because we aren't just surviving anymore. We're living. The capital world of the Vulpine matriarchy, Solara, did not look like the cold, jagged metallic hubs of the human Confederacy. Solara was a planet that breathed. Through my optical sensors, now recalibrated by Vulpine technicians to perceive a broader spectrum of psionic light, I watched the cities of the Sunstrider clan. They were grown from silicate-rich coral and reinforced by veins of living crystal that hummed at a frequency which made my internal gyroscopes feel constantly, pleasantly tilted. We had been on the surface for 14 days. Kaelen Vane occupied a recovery suite in the high spire, a room that smelled of cedarwood and a medicinal resin that the Vulpine used to knit human bone. His biometrics were finally stabilizing. The grade 4 concussion had receded into a dull, persistent ache, and the 3 fractured ribs were supported by a biokinetic brace that shimmered with a soft azure light. His right hand, the one that had gripped the white-hot power coupling in the void stitch, remained wrapped in a silver mesh cast. The skin underneath was a patchwork of red and translucent white, a permanent brand of the choice he had made in the dark. "Status report, A9, Kaelen grumbled. He was sitting on the edge of the hover cot, his bare chest a tapestry of old scars and new bruises. He was trying to tie his boots with one hand, his jaw set in that familiar line of Vanguard stubbornness. "Heart rate is 72 beats per minute, boss." Blood oxygen is at 98%. You are functioning at 94% of your baseline capacity, though your irritability levels are reaching a record-breaking 300%, I replied, floating near the crystalline window. Kaelen let out a short, sharp snort. Only 300? I must be getting soft. Where are the kids? Luma is currently in the Great Library, being lectured by 4 different high sages on the proper etiquette of a Sunstrider heir. My remote sensors indicate she has corrected them 3 times on the thermal dynamics of warp stitching. Ren is in the flight simulator, and Mika is currently attempting to feed her breakfast to a cleaning drone in the hallway. Kaelen paused, a ghost of a smile touching his lips before he suppressed it. He stood up, his spine clicking. A sound that echoed through the quiet room like a series of small explosions. He walked to the window, looking out over the sprawling canopy of the Vulpine world. The immediate aftermath of our escape from the Justicar had been a political firestorm. Silas Thorne had been recovered from his dead ship by a neutral salvage crew 3 days after we left him. He had survived, but the ice block Ren had created around his oxygen supply had caused significant neural frostbite. He would never hold a command again. The Confederacy High Command, embarrassed by the exposure of the Second Harvest plot and the loss of a battle group to a scavenger ship in an ancestral forest, had officially disowned Thorne. They called him a rogue element, a convenient lie that allowed the peace treaty to remain intact. The Iron Fang hardliners had fared worse. Matriarch Valeriana had purged her own ranks with a clinical, terrifying efficiency. The leaders of the Splinter Group had been stripped of their psionic ranks and exiled to the dead moons of the Outer Rim. The war that was supposed to consume the galaxy had been choked out in its cradle by a human mechanic and 3 children who refused to be pawns. The door to the suite slid open without a chime. Matriarch Valeriana stepped inside. She had shed her dragon glass armor for a simple robe of shifting silver silk. Her 3 tails moved with a rhythmic, calming sway. She looked less like a goddess of war and more like a woman who was carrying the weight of 2 species on her shoulders. "The council has finished its deliberation, Kaelen Vane," she said, her voice echoing in his mind with the resonance of a cathedral bell. Kaelen didn't turn around. "And? Am I a hero or a diplomatic liability this morning, Highness? To my people, you are the guardian of the Sunstride. To the human Confederacy, you are a ghost they would prefer to forget," Valeriana said, walking to stand beside him at the window. "They have offered a formal pardon for your desertion 10 years ago, provided you remain within Vulpine space. They do not want you returning to the core worlds to tell the story of what happened at Velis or in the Ossuary." Kaelen looked at his silver-wrapped hand. "I wasn't planning on going back. There's nothing there but paperwork and people who think blood is the only thing that binds a man to his post." "I have seen your memories, Kaelen," the matriarch said softly. "I have seen the moment you refused to burn the school at Velis. My sages call it a breach of duty. I call it the birth of a soul. You have spent 10 years trying to punish yourself for being human in a machine's war." "I'm a mechanic, Valeriana," Kaelen spat, finally turning to face her. "I fix things, that's it. I didn't save your kids to start a movement. I did it because they were in a box and they were hungry. And that is why you were the only one who could save them," she countered. Her golden eyes were unblinking. "The Iron Fang fought for an empire. Thorne fought for a contract. You fought for the people in the box. That is a distinction the galaxy has forgotten." At that moment, the door burst open again. Mika came sprinting in, her white-tipped tail a blur of motion. She dodged around the matriarch and latched onto Kaelen's good leg, burying her face in his trousers. Ren and Luma followed, looking harried. "Jonah!" Mika cried, her azure eyes wide. "The sages say we have to go to the palace for a month. They say you aren't allowed to come because you don't have a tail." Ren crossed his arms, his violet eyes flashing. "I told them I'd disassemble their library if they tried to keep him out. I already bypassed the lock on the sim deck." Luma stood back, watching Kaelen with an intensity that made my processors run hot. She was no longer the matted, terrified girl from the stasis pod. She was tall, regal, and carried a human hydro spanner tucked into her silk belt like a sacred relic. "The sages do not understand, Mother," Luma said, her voice steady. "They think the Guardian is a guest. They think he is salvage." Kaelen looked down at Mika, then at the 2 older children. He reached out with his good hand and ruffled the fur between Wren's ears, a gesture that would have gotten a human's hand bitten off by any other sunstrider. Wren leaned into the touch. "I'm not a palace guy, kids," Kaelen said, his voice regaining that gravelly scavenger rasp. "Too many rules. Not enough grease." "Then we will not stay in the palace," Valeriana said. It was a decree. The matriarch looked at Kaelen, and for a second the mask of the queen slipped, revealing the mother who had seen her children return from the grave. "A sanctuary is being built, Kaelen Vane, in the neutral sectors, near the edge of the ossuary, a place where the third way can be taught, a school for those who wish to learn the language of the wrench and the rhythm of the soul." Kaelen narrowed his eyes. "A school? You want me to be a teacher?" "I want you to be a father," Valeriana whispered. "To them, and to the others who will inevitably find their way to your door." Kaelen looked at me, then back at the children. The conflict that had defined his life for 20 years, the war between the soldier who followed orders and the man who followed his heart, was finally resolving. He wasn't a ghost anymore. He was a foundation. "A 9, Kaelen said. "Yes, boss. Divert all our remaining credits to the new station, and find me a ship that isn't made of coral. I need something with a real engine, something that needs fixing." "Already searching the databases, boss," I replied, my emotion circuits flickering. "Probability of us finding a magnificent piece of junk is currently 100%. The ossuary looked exactly as it had 10 years ago, and yet it was entirely different. To a casual observer, it was still a graveyard of starships, a belt of jagged iron and frozen memories orbiting the dying star Ignis Null. But as the Reliquary 2, a modified Vulpine human hybrid freighter, slid into a stable orbit, my sensors registered a change in the atmosphere. The silence of the void was no longer heavy with despair. It was filled with the active hum of reconstruction. The new station, named the Haven of the Kindred, was a massive structure wedged into the side of a hollowed-out asteroid. It was built of scarred human hull plating and elegant Vulpine crystalline struts, a messy, beautiful architectural paradox. It was a place where human refugees from Thorn's Cullings and Vulpine outcasts from the Ironfang Purges lived side by side, sharing ration bars and learning how to calibrate psionic-sensitive engines. Kaelen Vane stood on the observation deck, which we had modeled exactly after the old one, right down to the grease smear on the primary diagnostic console. He was 55 years old now. The metal fused to his spine still whirred on cold days, and his right hand was a map of silver scar tissue. But he moved with a fluid, relaxed grace that I had never recorded in my first 40 years of service. He was no longer a man built of sharp angles. He was a man who had been sanded smooth by the friction of a family. "Boss, the intake manifold on the main shuttle is acting up again," Wren's voice crackled through the station's comms. He was 15 now, his violet fur streaked with the grease of a master technician. "I think the psionic filter is out of sync with the fuel injectors. Mika says the engine is unhappy." Kaelen grabbed a heavy wrench from the rack, a real steel Vanguard issue tool. "Did you try twisting the coupling 3 times to the right, Wren?" "Yes, Dad. I'm not 12 anymore. It's a deeper issue. It's a feedback loop in the resonance chamber." "I'm coming down," Kaelen said, his voice warm. "And tell Mika that if she doesn't stop talking to the cleaning drones, I'm going to make her reprogram the scrubbers manually." I followed him as he walked through the corridors. This was the action of his new life. Not the tactical slide or the frantic fire, but the steady, rhythmic walk of a man with a purpose. Every person he passed, human or Vulpine, nodded with a respect that had nothing to do with rank and everything to do with the fact that Kaelen Vane was the man who kept the lights on. In the engineering bay, Luma was overseeing a class of 30 subadults. She was 18, a striking vision of Sunstrider nobility, her sky-blue fur gleaming under the industrial lights. She was holding a holographic projector, showing a detailed schematic of the void stitch. "The gap is not a hole," she was saying to her students, her amber eyes bright with intelligence. "It is a seam. If you approach it with force, it will tear you apart. But if you approach it with understanding, if you feel the rhythm of the space between stars, you can sow a new path. That is the first lesson of the Haven." Kaelen stopped at the door, watching her for a long minute. He didn't interrupt. He just stood there leaning against the frame, his scarred hand resting on the hilt of the wrench. I recorded a significant spike in his oxytocin levels. "She's good, isn't she?" Kaelen whispered to me. "She possesses a 98% instructional efficiency rating, boss," I replied. "And she has only threatened to bite 2 students this week. A significant improvement." Kaelen chuckled, a deep, resonant sound that felt like home. He moved on to the shuttle bay, where Ren and Mika were waiting. Mika, now 9 years old, was sitting on top of the shuttle's wing, her white tail wrapped around a sensor array. "It's the heart, Jonah," Mika insisted as he approached. "The crystal in the injector is lonely. It wants a friend." Kaelen climbed up the ladder, his joints protesting with a series of low-frequency clicks. He opened the access panel, peering into the glowing violet heart of the Vulpine engine. He saw the problem instantly: a small misalignment in the human-built mounting bracket. A tiny gap where blood and oil met magic. He didn't use a computer to fix it. He reached in with his scarred fingers, feeling the vibration of the crystal against his skin. He adjusted the bracket, his movements slow and deliberate, until the vibration smoothed out into a steady, rhythmic hum. "There," Kaelen said, wiping his hands on a rag. "The heart isn't lonely anymore, Mika. It's just focused. Like us." He sat down on the wing of the shuttle, looking out at the hangar where humans and foxes were working together to fix the galaxy, one bolt at a time. The transformation was complete. The ghost of Sector 4 was gone, buried under the debris of 1,000 repaired engines. In his place was a man who had realized that a soldier's duty ends with the war, but a father's duty never ends. I stood there on the wing of that ship, looking at the grease on my old scarred fingers, and for the first time in my 52 years, the air didn't taste like ozone and burnt insulation. It tasted like tomorrow. I spent 2 decades thinking that my life was defined by the triggers I pulled and the orders I refused. I thought I was a broken machine, a piece of vanguard salvage that the universe had forgotten to throw into the furnace. I thought that by hiding in the ossuary, I was keeping the world safe from me. But those 3 kids, they didn't see a monster. They didn't see a deserter. They saw a guy who had a ration bar when they were hungry and a wrench when the world was breaking. They taught me that the math of the universe isn't just about survival probabilities and tactical advantages. It's about the illogical, stubborn choice to give a damn about someone who doesn't look like you or speak your language. We're all just parts, I guess. Shattered hulls and rusted conduits drifting in the dark. But if you find the right people and you twist the coupling 3 times to the right, you realize you aren't junk. You're a heart, and a heart can fix anything, even a galaxy that's been trying to kill itself for a century. I'm still a mechanic, and I still hate the brass. But I finally understand that the most important thing I ever fixed wasn't an engine. It was me. Kaelen Vane climbed down from the shuttle, his boots hitting the deck with a solid, confident thud. He looked at Ren, who was already tightening the next bolt, and at Mika, who was singing a Vulpine lullaby to a cargo loader. He looked at Luma, who was leading a new generation toward the stars. He reached up and touched the winged skull tattoo behind his ear, but he didn't feel the phantom throb of the combat suite anymore. He felt the warmth of the station's suns. He turned to me, his eyes clear and full of a quiet, unshakable light. A 9 final status for the day? I processed the data of the entire haven, the laughter in the galley, the hum of the engines, the peace that occupied the space where the war used to be. "The station is at 100% integrity, boss," I said. "Life support is perfect. The magnetic shielding is holding, and the probability of us having a long, boring, beautiful life is currently off the charts." "Good," Kaelen said, walking toward the mess hall with his family. "Then let's go get some of that terrible sugary coffee. I think the matriarch is buying." I have spent my entire existence calculating the odds of death. I have mapped the trajectories of bullets and the decay of empires. I have watched a man transform from a weapon into a home. I see you out there, drifting in your own debris fields, holding onto your scars like they are the only things that define you. I see you wondering if you are too broken to be part of something whole again. So I have to ask you, if a man who was built to be a ghost can find his way back to the light through the eyes of his enemy, what is the one wall you have built around your heart that you are finally ready to kick down? What box are you waiting to be pulled from? Kaelen Vane picked up a stray bolt from the floor, turned it over in his hand once, and tossed it into his pocket with a soft, satisfied click. He didn't look back at the graveyard. He walked straight into the light of the kitchenette, where the smell of real food was finally beginning to drown out the scent of the void.